Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Change and Animal Health, Protecting Our Livestock. I'm delighted and grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you today. Before I begin, I'd like to express my gratitude that I live and work on Beer Pie country, to pay respect to Beer Pie elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I also want to thank Farmers for Climate Action and Vets for Climate Action for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to talk with you. Climate change and animals are two things that I'm passionate about, and I appreciate being able to share this with you. I'd like to start out by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm a vet, but I'm not a large animal vet. In fact, I'm a veterinary oncologist by training. For the last 30 years, my veterinary work has been exclusively in treating cancer in all species, although most of the animals that people bring to an oncologist are companion animals. But over the last 10 years, it's dawned on me that much as I love oncology, I can help more animals by helping to protect the environment they rely on and that we all share, than by treating one cancer at a time. So I've been gradually moving away from clinical veterinary medicine and doing more and more as a volunteer veterinary climate educator, doing things like this. So thank you for being part of my journey. So I want to be upfront that while we're going to talk about the big picture of how climate change affects our animals and looking after livestock in the situation, I'm not going to talk about the details of managing specific medical conditions. For specific medical advice, I'll refer you to my colleagues who specialize in that area, either your LLS vets or your own veterinarian. Now, I'm going to break my usual order of events at this stage as well. I usually show this slide later in my talk, and you will see it again, but I thought it would be a good idea for this audience if we talk about this right off the bat, so you have a bit of an idea of what to expect from me on this topic. Agriculture is a unique and complex player in climate change. It is, admittedly, a significant greenhouse gas emitter, but far from the majority of the problem, and we'll elaborate on this shortly. And it's a much more vital industry than those other industries that contribute far more to the problem. Most importantly, agriculture is highly vulnerable on the front lines of climate impacts, especially in Australia. And agriculture is a potential hero of this story by being one of the most practical sources of CO2 drawdown. Whenever I talk about climate change to any audience, I always let people know that the agricultural industry and farmers are working hard on this and deserve all the support that my veterinary profession and the public can give. And we'll talk more about this later on. Now back to the background. Although we face many important problems in today's complex world, I personally put my volunteer efforts into climate change because it affects every other issue. Climate change touches on everything we care about. We all care about our families, and if we have children or grandchildren, we try to ensure that their futures will be bright. We care about our communities. We want our friends and neighbors to be safe and healthy, our town to thrive. We want our farms and other businesses to be economically successful. As citizens and human beings, we care about immigration and defense, and we recognize moral and humanitarian problems. Climate change impacts on all of these. And as people who work with animals and natural systems, we worry about loss of biodiversity, climate change as a health threat, and particularly about the impact on animals. Although I was worried about the environment for years, and felt that as an educated person in a developed country, I ought to be doing something somehow to make things better. I just didn't know what or how. 9 years ago, I attended a training sponsored and presented by the Australian Conservation Foundation and the Climate Reality Project, which is founded and driven by former Vice President Al Gore. The other 499 attendees and I were taught the science behind why climate change is occurring, what's happening now, and what can potentially be expected under different possible conditions, and most importantly, what can be done to improve the situation. So as an oncologist, since I started doing this work, I've found that talking about climate change is a lot like talking with a veterinary client about their animal's cancer. I'm afraid I have some bad news. I know this is upsetting, but we do have some options to help control the condition, and they're not as bad as you may think. So in this presentation, I'm going to first give you an overview of climate science. I know many of you may know much of this already, but I think it's important to be sure that we have it all covered because there's so much talk about climate change nowadays that it's gotten to the point where if you don't already know it by now, you're a bit stuck. So I want to make sure that we're all starting on the same level of understanding. Then we'll talk about the impacts, especially on animals. This can get a little overwhelming. Actually, this is a cute photo, but the reality here is that it can be genuinely confronting. But I'm only setting the stage to explain the importance of the problem. We are really here to talk about solutions. So I'm going to ask you to stay with me, and we will shift gears and finish with a positive outlook and a focus on how we can work together to improve the situation. So climate change is a complex problem that stems from increased heat energy trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. This obviously leads to increased temperatures, which is a problem in itself, but the situation and its consequences are more complex than simply warmer weather, and we'll discuss this. I want to mention here that I'll be throwing some science at you in the next half hour or so, because I know that this is a very well-informed audience. But if you're not a data head, it's okay to let that wash over you and focus on the underlying messages. Now, before we go too far into the discussion, I think it's helpful to go over a little of the terminology around this topic. Weather is the atmospheric conditions over a short period of time, and climate is the background condition to weather, how the atmosphere behaves over relatively long periods of time. I live in a Mediterranean climate. Today, the weather is partly cloudy. The terms global warming and climate change are sometimes used interchangeably, but strictly they refer to slightly different things. For our purposes of conversation, we certainly can use them interchangeably, but I like to clarify this point because sometimes people think the change in terminology means we don't really know what's going on, which is not the case. Global warming or heating refers specifically to the Earth's rising surface temperature, while climate change includes warming and other effects of increased energy in the system, like melting glaciers, heavier rainstorms, and more frequent drought. Although the Earth has cooled and warmed before and the climate has changed before, the terms global warming and climate change in general use now usually mean the specific human-caused or anthropogenic problem that we're talking about today. It's also important to be clear right up front that the science on the main points surrounding climate change really is settled. It's not a question of belief. The essential facts of climate science have been in place for decades now. And in 2016, the Bulletin of Science, Technology, and Society reported that the consensus on AGW, anthropogenic global warming, among publishing scientists is verging on unanimity. Like any science, knowledge is still growing and there's much still to learn. But the remaining questions about the science of climate change are not whether or not it is real, happening now, serious, important, or urgent. If anything, the changes happening now are exceeding predictions, not the other way around. Globally, 19 of the 20 hottest years ever measured with instruments have been since 2001, and the other one was 1998. The 5 hottest years of all have been the last 5 years, with 2020 tying with 2016, and 2021 tying with 2018. Surface temperatures have risen significantly globally. But how can this be true when we can walk outdoors on some days and our senses tell us it's cooler than we expected? It's a matter of likelihoods. Every day, the temperature is either average, cooler than average, or warmer than average. What has happened is that compared to weather records in the past, we do still have cooler than average days, just fewer of them. And we have more days that are warmer than average and more days that are hot. These next few slides illustrate this. This first slide shows the global summer temperature distribution during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. You can see a nice bell-shaped normal distribution curve, and this serves as the baseline. Here we see the temperature distribution in the 1980s compared to the baseline set in the preceding 3 decades. And as you can see, the bell-shaped curve is still there, it's just shifted over to the right. And we're starting to see occasional extremely hot days. This shows the temperature distribution for the 1990s compared to the same baseline, and you can see the curve continues to shift further to the right. And in the first decade of this century, we see the curve shifting even further to the right, with more warmer than average days now than average days, and extremely hot days becoming increasingly common. Although we do still see cooler than average days, and this is why occasional cooler than expected weather doesn't disprove the science of climate change. Why is this happening? As you probably know, it's caused by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And while carbon dioxide or CO2 is certainly not the only culprit, it is a major player. CO2 is now commonly referred to as just carbon, although chemically, what we're talking about, of course, is not the element carbon, but rather the compound carbon dioxide. But a planet is really big. How can human activity possibly significantly change it? I find this image, taken from the International Space Station, helps me understand this. This is essentially a cross-section of our atmosphere. You can see the surface of the Earth with the sun shining through the troposphere and the stratosphere. The lowest layer of the atmosphere, where our weather takes place, is the troposphere. When I look at it this way, this is actually much thinner than I usually think of it from down here. To consider it another way, if you were to drive straight up in your car at normal highway speeds, you would reach the top of the troposphere in a little over 10 minutes. In less than an hour, you'd be, for all ordinary purposes, in space. That makes it much easier for me to grasp the idea that our atmosphere is smaller than we tend to think of it, and that human activity can actually influence its composition. Now, we sometimes hear people say things like, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can't possibly be harmful because it's a naturally occurring non-toxic component, and it's present at such a low concentration, just under 420 parts per million. Those are tiny, just 0.04%. But of course, people who work with animals know better. You and I know that there are plenty of components that may be present at low concentration and still have powerful effects. Here's just one example, blood potassium level. Just like CO2 in the atmosphere, blood potassium has a normal level in a similar parts per million concentration range to atmospheric CO2. For potassium, it's around 150 to 160 parts per million, and for CO2, it's 280. And that's needed for regular functioning. If we don't have enough potassium in our blood, we start to feel weak, wobbly, and eventually can't breathe. That's not great. And if we don't have enough CO2 in the atmosphere, we'll be very, very cold. But when the level goes above the normal level, at about a 50% increase from normal, we start to see trouble, again, in a concentration-dependent manner. And at about 122% increase from normal, the effects of a high blood potassium can be disastrous. Now, the CO2 level in the atmosphere fluctuates a few percent on an annual cycle, and the average annual level has increased nearly 50% since the beginning of industrialization. So if we think of the atmosphere as the blood of this huge organism called the biosphere, we know that this can have substantial effects. So how does this work? We know that much of the heat energy in the troposphere comes from solar radiation, and it warms us, which is a good thing. And some of this energy reflects off the surface of the Earth back into space, and the Earth itself produces infrared heat energy. And some of that reflected and produced heat is trapped by gases in the atmosphere, which are partially opaque to infrared, forming a cozy blanket. But if we increase the amount of these infrared blocking components or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by, for example, emitting CO2 faster than it's absorbed by natural processes like plant growth, then we have a thicker blanket and we'll have more trapping of heat energy within the atmosphere. And it goes from a good thing with an ideal temperature to a bad thing, where we're seeing a net increase of energy in the system. And that is what's happening now. Of course, climate change does not cause drought, flood, or fire by itself. We've always had those, and naturally, weather would still happen. What climate change does is set the background conditions where weather events form so that they tend to be more severe. There's more heat, energy, and water vapor in the system, so we'll be seeing more severe events more often. Now, farmers are all certainly familiar with the water cycle. As you know, this diagram teaches us that the overall amount of water in the Earth's system is fairly stable. A proportion of it is locked away as ice, and the rest moves around by evaporation, precipitation, and flowing back to the sea. Well, when we increase the energy in the system, it pumps up the whole cycle, as well as adding more liquid water to the system by unlocking previously frozen water that wasn't cycling. So increased evaporation leads to droughts, but also to increased water vapor in the atmosphere so that when it does rain, it rains bigger. Extreme precipitation events have produced more rain and become more common since the 1950s in many regions around the world, leading to these apocalyptic storms, colloquially known as rain bombs. In fact, rain bombs are 4 times more common globally now than they were in 1980. You don't need me to tell you that in the last few years, tragic, severe floods have affected people and animals in our area as well as around the world, causing billions of dollars in damage and untold suffering to people and animals, with hundreds of thousands of cattle killed and farmers seeing whole herds swept away. It's also important to remember that even those livestock not killed are at risk for health and welfare impacts, at risk for injury and infection, and even those not directly caught in the floodwaters could be affected by loss or contamination of their food or water supplies. And without power, milking sheds can't be operated, leaving those dairy farmers scrambling to try to look after their cows to minimize their pain and distress and their risk for mastitis. Like elsewhere, the floods in the Hastings Valley, where I live, caused massive losses to many businesses and families and horrific losses of livestock and horses. People living down at the mouth of the river were finding animals that had washed down the river. We had people down on the beach rescuing cattle from the surf that had managed to survive their trip downriver and been washed right out to sea. A local Facebook page sprang up for horse and livestock post-flood lost and found. Some of these animals were able to be sent back to their homes, but of course, sadly, many of them didn't make it or weren't found. And although this is a livestock-focused talk, everyone loves their companion animals too. There's so much a part of our families and our need for disaster response. But sometimes people wonder how global warming can be blamed for causing both more precipitation and flooding, and at the same time, more drought. The extra heat that's being trapped actually leads to both. And as the climate changes, precipitation patterns also change, leaving some places with less rainfall than before, and long-established, relatively predictable annual patterns starting to deteriorate and becoming less predictable. And that makes farming tougher and tougher. And as hard as it is at first to imagine that drought and floods could both be caused by the same problem, it's even harder initially to make the leap from flood to fire. But actually, we know that when fires occur, their severity depends on the preceding weather conditions. So when we have hotter, drier conditions, fires that occur will be more severe and harder to control. This is a screenshot from my fires near me in November 2019. That's me there. This was my backyard on that day and afterwards. And obviously, this is a severe risk for our animals too. And this is a problem for me as a vet. 30 years ago, I took an oath to use my scientific knowledge and skills for the protection of animal health and welfare, the prevention and relief of animal suffering, and the promotion of public health. Climate change clearly poses a threat to animal health and welfare, as well as to public health, and it causes animal suffering. So as a vet, I feel it's my duty to act on climate change. It's part of my job. Climate change impacts on animals in multiple ways, and I'll briefly go over some of these, although obviously a full treatment is way outside the scope of our time together. Now, there is a risk of overt suffering to domestic production animals as well as wild animals in heat waves, flood, and fires. In those 2019-2020 bushfires, as well as the estimated 3 billion wild native vertebrates killed or displaced, another 60 to 100,000 sheep and cattle were killed in those fires, and many hundreds of thousands of cattle, sheep, and horses were killed in floods in just the last 2 years. So looking at ways of protecting your animals, unfortunately, I think many of the farmers in New South Wales are probably, unfortunately, very familiar with how to protect their animals during flood or fire, but preparation is obviously the most important thing. Include your animals in your emergency plans, monitor changing conditions carefully, and move your animals to the safest areas, depending on the nature of the threat, ahead of time, if at all possible. If flooding is likely, don't forget to also try to protect your stocks of feed if possible, and your water sources. There are also less dramatic, but very important threats to animal health and welfare, and these overlap with threats to public health. For the most part, these center on infectious disease and food production. Finally, events such as severe storms, floods, and bushfires result in substantial economic losses to individuals and communities. A healthy and well-maintained domestic animal population depends on an economically stable society. So financial stress can leave farmers unable to maintain their animals. Now here, we're all passionate about animals, but there are people who don't value nature inherently. But even they need to recognize that humans are part of an ecosystem, and we will not go very far without a functioning biosphere. And climate change is a major health threat too. Infectious diseases, heat stress, air pollution, waterborne diseases, food security, and more are all influenced by a changing climate. We tend to think of heat as a discomfort rather than a killer, but that's not really accurate. And in fact, many more people died from the heat in the weeks leading up to Australia's Black Saturday bushfires than died in the fires themselves. And nearly 900 people died due to direct consequences of the North American heat wave in 2021. Similarly, more and more of Australia may become inhospitable for livestock all year round or at certain seasons due to the heat. Heat is a major problem for production animals in Australia. A 2003 study in the US estimated that the total annual economic losses to livestock industries caused by heat stress amounted to between 1.7 and $2.4 billion. Now, a full treatment of heat stress is more than we have time for in this talk, but just touch on a couple of high points. Sheep and cattle can regulate their body temperature within a narrow range of air temperatures, the thermoneutral zone. That's about 25 degrees for beef cattle and sheep. When the temperature rises above that, they'll dissipate heat. Cattle and sheep do this by radiation, which is just letting the heat rise, evaporation, which means mostly sweating for cattle and panting for sheep, conduction, which is mainly drinking cool water, convection, which is warm air rising, or wind or a fan, and by their behavior, like seeking shade, reducing activity, and spreading out to maximize their surface area. If the air temperature is higher than the animal's body temperature, evaporation is really the only option. When humidity is also high, evaporation is more difficult, and if the animal is dehydrated on top of this, that makes heat transfer even more difficult. Other factors that can increase the risk of heat stress include genetics. This photo shows the effect of coat color on the surface temperature of cattle. This is a very straightforward study. It was done in a cool environment on a cool day. The temperature ranged from 2.5 to 5 degrees, and they simply measured the surface temperature of a white cow, a red cow, and a black cow. The white cow's back is just under 12 degrees, which is great. The red cow's back is 22 degrees, which is fine. The black cow's back on a 3-degree day is 50 degrees. Imagine what that cow is going to feel like on a 30-degree day. Other factors can include the presence or absence of fleece, physiologic states such as lactation, crowding, and transportation. Now, heat stress results in a range of impacts, from reduced fertility, decreased birth weight and weaning weight, reduced feed intake and weight gain, reduced milk production, as much as 15%, reduced wool production and quality, and even intergenerational effects. This is amazing. Reduced future milk production in the future calves of heat-stressed heifers. Now, like with most health problems, it's much, much better to prevent heat stress than it is to treat it. The best way to protect animals from heat stress is to first select relatively heat-tolerant genetics. Nutritional management, feeding the energy-dense portion of the ration overnight when it's cooler, and remembering that the heat increment of digestion peaks at about 3 hours after feeding. Providing plentiful shade can't be overemphasized, especially for cattle. Sometimes sheep don't use shade structures, and remember that trees are the best source of shade because of additional cooling properties. It's very important to provide plenty of clean water. Ventilation is extremely important. If possible, on a very hot day, consider fans, consider sprinklers if possible. Avoiding crowding is so important, and absolutely avoiding transportation of heat-stressed animals. So there's no one solution, and all of this needs to be tailored to the individual situation. And it does cost, and it takes time, of course, but it can be cost effective in avoided production losses. Oh, and try to avoid having extreme heat waves. Now, warmer temperatures also have an impact on the spread of infectious diseases. The potential range for many diseases expands as regions farther and farther poleward get warmer. This means that there are more and more places where tropical diseases, especially vector-borne diseases, can spread. Many insects that spread animal and human diseases are increasing their range in Australia and elsewhere, including mosquitoes, midges, biting flies, and ticks. The warmer, wetter conditions we're experiencing favor their spread to higher latitudes and altitudes and longer seasons. And this means that some exotic animal diseases could get closer. One example is blue tongue virus, which is spread by wind-borne chelocoides midges. These are among the arthropods that are extending their range, and the best thing we can do to protect our animals from this is insect control and isolating infected animals. Another example is Japanese encephalitis. Japanese encephalitis is mostly transmitted by bites from infected culex mosquitoes. There are two main sets of amplifying hosts, which are water birds and pigs are the most clinically affected of our domestic species. The disease in pigs results in a proportion of piglets mummified, stillborn, or weak, encephalitis in piglets up to 6 months old, and also infertility in some boars. Now, Japanese encephalitis was previously considered a tropical disease, with a few cases found in the Torres Strait and the top end in the 1990s. In 2002, the disease had moved all the way south to New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia, affecting over 60 piggeries and causing 35 human cases and 3 human deaths. This is the effect of changing conditions favoring the broader range of the transmitting mosquitoes. So whenever we hear people talking about climate change, we usually hear about the cost to the economy of the actions we need to take to help control it. But you know that if diseases like blue tongue, Japanese encephalitis, and others like lumpy skin disease become established throughout Australia, that's going to be a huge cost in lost productivity. The loss to farms of the animals lost in those droughts, floods, and fires is massive, as is the loss of infrastructure. And just like the health impacts of heat in humans is stealthy but substantial, so is the loss of productivity from excess heat in production animals. For all these problems, there are strategies to help manage them, but it's much, much better avoided than treated once they occur. And it's always better to get to the root cause of the problem than to just manage the symptoms. And the root cause of all these is worsened by climate change already, and it's just going to keep getting tougher and tougher the worse we let climate change get. So the best way to protect our livestock from the animal health impacts of climate change is to do all we can to stop climate change from getting any worse. So if we're going to talk about the cost of action to curb climate change, we need to balance that against the cost of climate change itself. Economic losses from extreme weather totaled $653 billion over the past 2 years. So from perspectives of biodiversity, health, economy, and infrastructure, we really need to do something about this. But now, as I promised, I have a lot of good news for you too. There are 2 main categories of response: adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation, now often also called resilience, means accepting some change and learning how to manage with it. And mitigation means taking steps to minimize the amount of change that will occur. I focus more on mitigation rather than adaptation because adaptation generally centers around the needs of humans and doesn't solve the problem very well for other species. But the truth is that we do need both because we're committed already to a certain level of warming. So right now, the outcome we're striving for is to limit warming to as close as possible to 1.5 degrees or minimize the overshoot. Now, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but as a global average, that's still a huge amount of energy. And remember that 1.5 degrees makes the difference between ice and water, or between feeling well or in bed with a fever. And a relatively small increase in the average temperature means a big increase in extremes. So this gives rise to the idea of a carbon budget based on scientific estimates of how much more CO2 can probably be emitted without exceeding this threshold. And a newer term you may have heard is drawdown or sequestration, literally drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, this is one of the areas where agriculture has so much to offer. So we're definitely going to loop back to this. As I said earlier, CO2 is a major greenhouse gas, but it's not the only one. And others include methane and water vapor. So in that case, why all the fuss about CO2? The reasons are that it contributes a major proportion to warming. It's the main greenhouse gas that's produced by human activity, and also because it's the greenhouse gas most likely to be controllable with reasonable regulations and laws. And while there are other sources of CO2 emissions, the biggest by far is the production and burning of fossil fuels. Here are the fossil fuel emissions by source in Australia in 2018. Transport, electricity, and industry together make up the great majority. So now we know where the problem is coming from, and we can begin to address it very specifically. And there is much that can be done about this. Now, mitigation efforts in the past have emphasized individuals and businesses minimizing their personal impact, switching off lights, using recycled paper products, riding a bike instead of driving a car, and far more. And that's great, and it should continue. But in the face of industrial scale extraction and emissions, a big push has to come from government, industry, and finance, and it's starting to happen. Now, this is a global problem, and so global cooperation is vital. Another key is money. The finance sector is progressing quickly, recognizing the economic risks of climate change and old technologies. Many scientific and financial experts now agree that doing nothing about climate change is already becoming more costly than doing something, and that, in fact, a change will be win-win. The equation is no longer the economy versus the environment. The equation is now the economy and the environment both on the same side versus old thinking. We're starting to hear leading figures in business saying things like, if we act on climate change, we'll have more productivity, better health. Acting on it brings us jobs, livelihoods, and profits. And here's one example. The RE100 initiative has partnered with over 230 major global corporations committed to source 100% of their global electricity from renewable sources. Now, the Climate Council's latest report, titled Aim High, Go Fast, finds that we actually do need to go pretty hard to avert severe climate change, but that we can do it. They actually recommend a 2030 target of 75% emissions reduction and net zero by 2035. But they also advise that we have the technology to do this. The hard, but not unsolvable part is in the non-technical side of the transition. But that doesn't mean that postponing further will make it any easier. In 2021, the International Energy Agency released a report with detailed recommendations on how to achieve the needed reductions, including a rapid shift away from fossil fuels to clean energy investment, and noted that all the technologies needed already exist. So this seems like a good time to sort out some jargon. So we'll just pick some of this apart. Now, carbon neutral or net zero carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions is achieved when emissions of CO2 are balanced globally by CO2 offsets. Net zero emissions are achieved when emissions of all greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and others in CO2 equivalents are balanced by greenhouse gas removals. Climate neutrality is achieved when activities result in no net effect on the climate system, including aspects other than greenhouse gas emissions, such as biogeophysical effects like albedo. 100% renewable is an interesting one, because at this stage, we can't actually sort electrons that came from a solar panel from electrons that came from a coal-fired power plant once they're in the grid. So at this stage, this realistically means that as much electricity from renewable sources is put into the grid as what we use. So it's a net thing rather than an absolute thing. And then taking a step beyond these, climate positive and carbon negative both mean that more CO2 is removed from the atmosphere than is emitted, essentially leaving the place cleaner than we found it. As mentioned earlier, this is a step beyond adaptation and mitigation, also known as sequestration or drawdown. Well, there's actually an organization called drawdown.org doing a lot of great work in this field. They released a report in 2020, finding similarly that we already have the technology to reach negative emissions by the 2040s and identifying 80 areas where we can reduce and even reverse emissions using currently existing technology. The top 5 areas identified were energy, especially wind and solar, food, especially agriculture and preventing waste, industrial chemicals and materials, boring old efficiency, and transportation. The lesson to take away from these reports is that we don't have to and can't afford to wait for new technology to come along. We need to do what we can with what we have. Luckily, that's something that Australians, and especially farmers and vets, are especially good at. So going back to agriculture, agriculture's role in climate change, climate resilience, and mitigation is a huge topic. As mentioned before, it is historically a significant greenhouse gas emitter after fossil fuel use. But we absolutely need agriculture, whereas, as we just learned, we are technically able to phase out fossil fuels. And agriculture has a lot to lose to climate change and has the ability to make a big contribution to climate change mitigation and can even benefit directly from mitigation actions through side benefits on the farm and economic benefits of participating in carbon markets. You know that using farming and animal husbandry principles that reduce emissions and rehabilitate the overall ecosystem of the farm result in better productivity and healthier soil, as well as being less polluting in other ways. And there are more and more resources available to assist with this. So we're going to come back to some specific initiatives and strategies for producing food sustainably in a bit. But as we said before, the biggest emitter is fossil fuel-based energy production. So here's an example of progress in that area. Back in 2000, the best projections for wind energy were that we would reach 30 gigawatts worldwide by 2010. That projection has now been beaten by 22 times over. When we look at the amount of wind energy being built around the world, we see an exponential curve because the cost has come down so quickly. Wind energy could supply 40 times more electricity than the entire world currently uses. Now, some people don't like the appearance of the turbines. I personally think they look futuristic and beautiful, but not everyone agrees. But I don't think any apologies. I think my signal dropped out and I lost my Zoom connection, but we're back. Not quite yet. Thank you for your patience. There. Thanks for your patience. Electricity from wind and solar are now cheaper than electricity from new coal plants or new natural gas plants. And here's a co-benefit for developing countries. Renewables can be less centralized. In many areas affected by energy poverty, it's actually lack of grid access, not lack of coal, that's the problem. Now, in areas where there's no universal electricity grid, customers and businesses can leapfrog over old technologies and install small-scale renewables in places that have long been denied access to electricity. So we can definitely meet this challenge. The solutions are at hand. We only need to decide to implement them. This is not to say that it won't take resolution, care, and attention to justice in transitions, but it is to say that it's not a hardware problem. So what can we do? There are 3 things that everyone can do. Use your choice, your vote, and your voice. Now, we all know ways to reduce our personal climate impact, and it's valuable to do the best that we each personally can. Next, we need to think about where we spend our money. Every time you make a purchase, you're giving things a little push one way or the other. So we need to think about these choices, whether we're getting our weekly groceries or choosing our superannuation. Each choice we make can be a force for good. If we think climate change is important, we need to elect policymakers who will work for the public good, help them understand the problem, and work with them to help them make good decisions and policy. And in order to get that job done, we need to be able to talk about climate change and its impacts and stop avoiding the topic as if it's impolite. And we need to not only privately do the right thing, but allow ourselves to be seen doing the right thing. Normalize it. So an important thing we can do is not run away from those barbecue or kids' soccer game conversations about climate change in our communities. This doesn't have to be divisive, as many fear it will. It's just science information. Climate change is not inherently a political problem. It's become politicized. But at its heart, climate change is a science problem, and we can do that. And you don't have to be a climate scientist. We all trust and rely on scientific consensus every day without being primary experts in the field. I'm doing it right now. I'm not an electronics engineer. I have no idea how this laptop works, and yet I'm using it. Lots of people who aren't aviation engineers get on planes. We can and need to trust the scientific consensus on climate change too, in a matter-of-fact way. Now, for the vets here, a group led by Colleen Duncan at Colorado State University has published a series of papers on attitudes about climate change in the veterinary profession over the past few years. These were coming out at the same time as some of the other things I'm about to show you, but I think it's really helpful to look at this information first. The first one reports the results of a survey of over 900 veterinary students, and the second one surveyed over 600 veterinarians. In both studies, the respondents were overwhelmingly confident that climate change is happening due to human activities impacting on human and animal health. They felt vets should take a leadership or advocacy role on climate change, especially through educating the public, particularly in clinical practices where sustainability information can be shared with clients. Now, the third study surveyed over 1,000 pet owners and found that the majority believe climate change is occurring, and 2/3 would value knowing that their vet received training on the animal health impacts of climate change. More than half of veterinary clients surveyed would pay more for services at a clinic with a reduced environmental impact. And clients would value some form of sustainability certification to aid in identification of such practices. Wow. We're going to circle back to this in a few minutes. So about 4 years ago, I heard from a vet in Queensland named Jeanette Kessels, who had a bold vision. She was very concerned about climate change too, and had been inspired by Charlie Prell and Farmers for Climate Action, and wanted to start an Australian organization for vets. Needless to say, I couldn't wait to get involved. So Vets for Climate Action was founded in late 2019. Our mission is to inspire the veterinary profession to advocate for and achieve climate action within and beyond our profession to help ensure a sustainable future for all. As a few examples of VFCA's work so far, we contributed to the Bushfires Royal Commission and the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action Bushfire and Climate Summit processes in 2021, as did Farmers for Climate Action, resulting in a full-page ad in The Australian. We've developed a good working relationship and an MOU with our industry body, the AVA. And in response, the AVA formed a climate action working group, which has led to the development and ratification of AVA's climate change policy. We've also helped the AVA include plenaries and workshops on climate change and sustainability in its continuing education offerings over the last few years. A few of us joined 30 other delegates from health organizations under the Climate and Health Alliance umbrella, meeting with federal lawmakers, explaining the connection between climate change and health impacts and the importance and urgency of the problem. Providing educational opportunities for the vet profession is part of our mission. As well as talks like this and working with providers like the AVA, VFCA has produced a seminar series that addresses various topics around climate change and sustainability and are available on the VFCA website. And one of VFCA's proudest achievements, the Climate Care Program by Vets for Climate Action, is empowering vet teams to take the lead on environmental sustainability and climate change by providing tools and knowledge to integrate solutions into day-to-day vet practice, and it just launched a few weeks ago. There are also other good initiatives around the world. In the UK, Vet Sustain helps veterinary professionals be a leading force for sustainability, and Veterinary Sustainability Alliance just recently launched in North America. And at the end of 2020, the World Veterinary Association released a position statement on what it describes as the global climate change emergency. So there's so much going on in climate and my profession, and I'm so inspired and encouraged that we can work on this together. And now the best part, the part you've been waiting for, There's so much happening in agriculture too. Firstly, few people that I talk to outside of agriculture, even vets, know that the Australian red meat industry has set a target that by 2030, Australian beef, lamb, and goat production and processing aim to make no net release of greenhouse gas emissions. This is amazing, and everyone I tell is so surprised and excited about it. MLA plans to support this through research and development to help the industry reduce emissions while increasing productivity and diversify profit streams by participating in the carbon market. Core strategies to achieve this include learn about carbon accounting, consider breeding and management adjustments to reduce methane emissions, and keep an eye out for new feeds and supplements that may be coming out in the years to come. Consider on-farm energy efficiency and renewable energy. Lean towards deep-rooted pasture grasses and legumes, and look for ways to increase trees and vegetation to improve soil carbon and other animal health benefits. MLA has lots of resources available on how to farm more sustainably and reduce your own emissions, and when, why, and how to participate in the carbon market, which is producing and selling Australian carbon credit units. Most recently, just a few weeks ago, they launched an online carbon calculator based on the sheep and beef greenhouse gas accounting framework. That's available on the MLA website. As we just talked about, in order to know how to go ahead, you need to know where you're starting from. And here's a little fun bit. Agrivoltaics is the fancy word for growing crops or livestock in the same space with solar panels. And as it turns out, early studies have shown, contrary to what was previously thought, that solar installations would waste arable land, they can actually benefit the agriculture as well as producing emissions-free electricity for use on the farm and export. So one benefit of the panels is that they provide shade. Remember what we talked about a few minutes ago about how important it is to provide shade for livestock. And you can see that these sheep are enjoying it. Another benefit is water condensation on the panels, essentially watering the pasture, which is a big benefit in times of drought. So a 2020 study looking at sheep in Brazil that were given a choice between no shade, 80% blackout shade cloth, and solar panels found that the animals spent less than 1% of their time under the shade cloth compared to 38% of their time under the photovoltaic panels. The shade under the panels was actually cooler because of reduced radiant heat load compared to the cloth. And a 2022 study of sheep farms in New South Wales found that merinos grazed under solar panels produced more and better quality wool. So obviously this is early days for this, but certainly encouraging so far. Also, just a few weeks ago, Farmers for Climate Action released their Farming Forever report, a national plan for climate change and agriculture. The report is based on surveys of 600 Australian farmers, plus in-person farmer and industry roundtables in 2022, to attempt to understand the challenges and opportunities they see associated with climate change. The number one takeaway is that farmers want to reduce on-farm emissions, but don't feel they have enough resources and support to help them get started. And the report calls on the federal government to help farmers take part in the available opportunities. Farmers for Climate Action's CEO, Fiona Davis, said, the survey found 93% of farmers are willing to shift to low emissions production, but just 30% have a practical demonstration of how. And that carbon farming in a high integrity market can produce huge benefits for farmers, but just 10% of farmers are growing and selling carbon, and 70% say they don't understand the carbon market. So the report recommended a coherent national approach to climate change and agriculture policy, with programs and more on-ground staff or extension officers to educate farmers on how to reduce emissions and create new income from carbon. So if you haven't done so already, check it out. You can find the report on the Farmers for Climate Action website. And remember, that report called on the federal government. So Federal Agriculture Minister Murray Watt responded positively, announcing that he and the state and territory agriculture ministers had resolved to make agricultural sustainability one of the shared national priorities and to develop a national statement on climate change and agriculture that will both acknowledge the work the sector is already undertaking and assist in bridging the gap for so many farmers between the desire to act on climate change and the ability to practically implement that. So this announcement is a big win for farmers and for Farmers for Climate Action, although it's only a first step. It's only an announcement, and the real proof will be in the statement itself when it comes out and in the implementation. So this is really an exciting area in both of our fields. And if you haven't already, this is a great time to join Farmers for Climate Action. So thank you so much for your attention today. I really appreciate your being involved in climate change and animal health. Thank you.